Not far from the Blackwall Tunnel, at the Poplar end of the Commercial Road, the Troxy Cinema opened in 1933 with the classic film King Kong. It was not just a film show you got for your sixpence. Stars like Gracie Fields, Louis Armstrong, Larry Adler and Sophie Tucker would personally share the program with usually 2 feature films, a Mickey Mouse cartoon, the news, together with live music from the mighty theatre organ. The Troxy was one of a group of cinemas, including the West End Trocadero and the Kilburn Gorman State, developed by Phil Hyams and his brother Sid, sons of an East End baker. Before 1939, the Hyams boys were major entrepreneurs in the cinema industry. Today, the Troxy, used as a rehearsal center for theatrical productions, is no longer part of the Hyams business interests. But Phil, now in his 95th year, shares his memories with his grandson Ron and with us, beside the old Troxy. From his office near Oxford Circus, where daily Phil puts in a few hours' work, he recalls an event he witnessed in the East End in the year 1903.
The next most exciting thing is when I was about 10 years old, during the Kishenok-Brook Road, when the people fled in their thousands and they came to London as well as other cities, and obviously they came to the East End. And I remember quite well that the people in Fieldgate Street put up trestles in the road, brought food, and fed these hungry people. And that's a sight I'll never forget.
160 years ago, the Commercial Road was a twisting, narrow road. White Horse Lane was its name then. But the expanding East India Company needed a wide main road to bring its cargoes from the nearby London docks to their warehouses in the city. And for us East End kids, well, those who were not afraid to go into the non-Jewish areas like Wapping and Rotherhithe, the docks and the river had a special fascination. Films like Treasure Island and Mutiny on the Bounty had a powerful effect. Those docks just behind Commercial Road was real adventure. But this was where we saw the vicious, rough poverty of our non-Jewish neighbors in the streets we were warned to stay away from. These were the streets that brought Dr. Bernardo to open his first home in Stepney Causeway, close by to where the Troxy stood. Yet even before the First World War in 1914, Harry Abrahams was at the Troxy end of the Commercial Road, with neighbors like Hyman Levine the confectioner, Samuel Lewis Taylor, and Louis Henriques, hairdresser. Arbour Square is just beyond the Stepney Causeway. The square was also there in Dr. Bernardo's day, and when we cross over the road to the north side, Arbour Square is just a few yards back from the Commercial Road. The Victorian planners did attempt to give some elegance to those streets near the docks. Elegant, too, is the frontage of the Congregation of Jacob Synagogue, just 2 streets to the west of Arbour Square. Built in 1921, this is one of the few East End synagogues still struggling hard to survive. Jack Wallkind, who recently retired as the chief executive of the London Borough of Tower Hamlets, was bar mitzvahed here.
That shul was not just the place where I got bar mitzvahed. My father was the secretary during the 20s and 30s, and he built that place into a thriving community. And the shul was as much my home as the terraced house where we lived just round the corner in Sydney Street. I'm often asked why I devoted my professional career to a borough in the East End. It might sound pretentious, but those buildings we lived in, those slums throughout East London, I felt I just had to do something to give our people in the borough a decent place to live in. I firmly believe that what really matters most is the quality of life, the way we live, and the environment. There's still a great deal to be done, and we've all learned a lot from the past. And the past brings me back to my old shul. It's becoming a superhuman task to keep it alive. The shul regularly has its Shabbat minyan and often weekday services, but unless new members, new people can be brought in, perhaps from Docklands, then like so many of the shuls off the Commercial Road, and literally there must have been some 30 to 40 shuls and shtiblach just around there, in 5 years or so, I doubt whether even one synagogue will remain in that part of the East End. But at least these streets have given us rich memories.
Jack Wallkind and his colleagues have undoubtedly transformed much of Sydney Street and the Commercial Road. Watney Market, across the road, was a narrow marketplace running down to Cable Street. It had a motley of small shops and stalls, some owned by Jewish traders. But here, on the opposite side of Commercial Road, during the 1930s, you had Weinbau Furnishing, a Joe Lyons tea shop, Rashberg's Kosher Saltbeef Restaurant, Longuehay's department store with Liff Chemists on the corner of Philpott Street. It is from here that we can begin to appreciate Jack Wallkind's theme of rich memories. Let's use the Lloyd's Bank as a reference point as we go back just some 5 years or so. You can still see the Lloyd's Bank in the distance, but close to us now is an Oriental-style cinema with twin white towers. Between the towers is a dome, the Palaceum. About 80 years ago, the dome and the minarets were the crowning glory to Britain's first and only purpose-built Yiddish theatre. With 900 seats, an ambitious program of grand opera and the finest of the world's drama was planned. 12,000 shares of £1 each had been floated. Samuel Alman, the choirmaster of the Great Synagogue, Duke's Place, was commissioned to compose a new opera, King Ahaz, in Yiddish. In a program note, the first nighters were requested, don't bring any nuts or oranges, keep the theatre free of dirt. Even so, the theatre critic of the London evening newspaper, The Star, commented, the audience partook of refreshment all through the performance. The success of King Ahaz rushed the over-ambitious directors to produce Rigoletto and Pagliacci in Yiddish, forcing up the seat prices beyond the means of most East Enders. Of the 12,000 shares, only 2,000 were sold, and 6 months after Die Tempel opened to rapturous applause, Feynman's Yiddish theatre was forced to close. Today, you may park your car on the site where music critics said that Samuel Alman had made a considerable reputation for himself beyond the limits of the community to which he belongs. We've nearly reached the crossroads where the New Road and facing it the Cannon Street Road meet us here in the Commercial Road, and where on the extreme right you see the red and white shop fascia, Hot Numbers. This is where Kuczynski, now in prestigious Knightsbridge, had their jewellery shop. We plan to take you into New Road in another program on Stepney itself. But leaving you with this view of Sussex Laundry on the corner of New Road, let's go back to 1935 and visit Frumkins on the opposite corner of Cannon Street Road, celebrating the Silver Jubilee of King George V and Queen Mary. Frumkins left some 20 years ago for the West End, where Aaron Frumkin, proudly and reverently, tells his customers and friends about the historic story of the family business.
This is 1910. I'm the baby in my mother's arms. My grandfather had returned to his vineyards in Petah Tikva, leaving my parents to run things in London. We started in 1894. Nearly 100 years ago. He was a remarkable scholar, my grandfather. He was not just one of these early Zionist pioneers. He was the author of 13 books on history and philosophy. And back here in the East End, my father was only absorbed in studying Talmud all day long. No time for our wine trade. Everything was left to my mother. Not only did she develop a very successful business, she also found time to go to Whitehall and battle with officials there for German refugees to stay in London, and often was very successful. In her day, my mother was a beautiful woman. Let me tell you something. She learnt about family planning, and into our shop regularly came young mothers for advice. She was a legend in her own lifetime.
Aaron Frumkin told me about another legend from his boyhood, his charismatic Cheder just a few turnings along in Cannon Street Road, Rabbi Avraham Lipshitz. Daily, even on Shabbos, his home was the Cheder to over 100 boys and girls. He was a strong disciplinarian, a fervent Zionist, collecting halfpennies weekly from his pupils for the pioneers in Palestine. Nobody questioned his orthodoxy. Yiddishkeit, blended with secular studies, was his strong point, a way of life his own family so notably passed on to others. Chaim was the firstborn child that Zelda Lipshitz brought to the Rebbe in their Cheder home in 1906. At his bar mitzvah, Chaim, meeting his father's expectations, delivered his speech 3 times, in Hebrew, Yiddish, and English. And within the Lipshitz family, it was no surprise that Chaim at 14 was his school's pianist. He became a rover scout. Scouting was a youth movement the Rebbe Lipshitz fully approved of, unlike the anti-Orthodox club activities of Basil Henriques at the Oxford and St. George's Club, which in those early days was immediately opposite the Lipshitz Cheder. The Oxford and St. George's attracted many youngsters. The club had much to offer, and Chaim, like his father, was concerned about Henriques' active opposition to Zionism. This conflict in Cannon Street Road played a part in forming Habonim, soon to become the leading Zionist youth movement in the English-speaking world.
Our first Gedut Trumpeldor met in my father's Cheder in 1929. Yes, we were very concerned about Henriques and his anti-Zionist activities. We had to come up with a program which would compete with cricket, football, billiards, and the usual fun and games of clubs. The pioneers of Palestine, building up the land, a blending of scouting and Jewish tradition. That was what we wanted to get across. So our Bonim, our builders around the Commercial Road, had to make their own bricks from cardboard. You had to make a brick to reach the status of a bonnet. Abe Herman, one of our first Bonim, became Dean of the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. He was also an Israeli ambassador at the United Nations. He too made his Levena, his brick. Habonim gave us Kfar Blum, Bet HaEmek. Wherever you are in Israel, there is somebody from Habonim.
Through my father, I was already a Zionist and interested in all Jewish matters. I had been a Girl Guide troop captain at the 3rd Stepney, so my Girl Guides ended our meetings with Hatikva. Habonim excited me, as it did many other girls. Soon we had our own Gedud Naomi, made up of girls only. The boys and girls did get together for rambling, sing songs, histories, discussion groups, etc. The first big camp was at Herne Bay in 1933. We wondered, would our parents agree to boys and girls going together? It was unheard of then. Things were quite a bit different in those days. There was fun, certainly, but there was discipline too. I married Chaim Rosenoff, now Rose. He was one of the very first Bonim at Gedut Trumpeldor.
In 1935, Lily and Chaim were married in the Stepney Orthodox Shul, reception at the La Boheme ballrooms, and the photograph by Boris. For weddings, Cannon Street Road Synagogue was one of the popular shuls in the area. Cantor Halter was an exceptional chazan. He composed many synagogal pieces, and his boys' choir, which he trained and conducted at services, was considered by many to be far superior than the great synagogue choir at Duke's Place. The Reverend Halter, as a Moel, offered, one might say, the complete package. In the Yiddish newspaper Die Zeit, his advertisement headline is the Hebrew Baruch Habo, I am here, and goes on to stress in Yiddish his thorough and practical approach. Cannon Street Road closed down many years ago, and should you wish to visit the shul in which you may have enjoyed many a simcha, then look for Fabian, the button and trimming merchants. They now occupy the site. Roggs, on the corner of Burnham Street, is just beyond Fabian Trimmings. His shop is probably the last Jewish delicatessen in the area. A good deal of his trade appears to be from old-time loyal customers who still travel from far away to buy his schmaltz herrings and fried fish balls. And some of Roggs' customers must have lived in Langdale Mansions just around the corner. Not these newly built flats, but the dreary slums so common throughout East London. And in 1939, the Stepney Tenants Defence League rallied many thousands to support the tenants of Langdale Mansions. For 3 months, those tenants refused to pay any rent. Eventually, their landlords gave in. The battle was won. Opposite Langdale Mansions is Hessel Street, famous from the beginning of the century as the Jewish food market of East London. But by the end of the 1950s, Hessel Street, which runs from Burslem Street to Commercial Road, began to identify with the new immigrants. The three gentlemen in conversation on the right are standing on the same corner you see now. You are looking along Hessel Street Market to Commercial Road. And to really appreciate the attractive new houses that Jack Wallkind dreamed of, look to the right from Hessel Street, along Burslem Street, where it meets Cannon Street Road. The far building was the rear of Cannon Street Road Shul. Murray Fox was born in Hessel Street in 1909. Although the family business was in Commercial Road, he has not been back there for some years now.
I'm quite flabbergasted. I just can't believe it. This is just opposite where we live. We were across the road. Manham at 24A. When I last saw it, it was Lipotkin. There's the boys Lipotkin. That must be something like 10 years back. You're really teasing me, and I'll tell you why. Because where today you see the mattress in the road, that shop was Seville the grocer. In our day, that Seville shop was spotless. Absolutely spotless. Everything just gleamed. Yes, and there was Lippy Lipman the poulterer, with Yetta Levine the fishmonger next door. Hessel Street was one long aquarium. And there was Jack Solomon's. You know him, the boxing promoter. He had live fish in his tank, and so did Ruder.
Let's give Murray Fox a moment to catch his breath as we look at Hessel Street of today against some statistics. Today, there are 19 shops listed in the official street directory, not one Jewish. 50 years ago, 74 shops, all Jewish. There were 10 grocers, 9 butchers, 8 poulterers, 6 drapers, and 6 job buyers, 5 fruiterers, 4 bakers, 3 shoe shops, 2 feather merchants, 1 tinsmith, 1 tailor, and a total of 19 fishmongers. The records show that many a famous entrepreneur came out of Hessel Street, but the Fox family story has something special about it. Murray Fox's grandfather, Menachem Mendel, arrived in London from Berdichev in Russia in the early 1900s. To him, the East End was a religious wilderness, a midbar, so he decided to return to Deheim. His son-in-law, Avraham Zacharia, a capmaker, decided to stay. He established in nearby Little Turner Street a small synagogue, the Berdichev Stiebel. With the help of his wife and 4 children, they did well in the cloth business, and like many, they eventually settled in northwest London via Stamford Hill. Caring for the elderly was a special concern of Sam, Maury's elder brother. He dedicated himself to fulfill the mitzvah not to forsake those in their old age. In 1979, Sam Fox saw his hard work come to life. A home for the elderly opened in Hendon. A few years later, now into his 80s, Sam decided to settle in Netanya. And there too, he continued his work helping the elderly and also the young in so many ways. In 1989, at the age of 89, Sam Fox, the grandson of Menachem Mendel from Berdichev, was awarded by the mayor of Netanya the Certificate of Honor for Outstanding Services to the city. Sam in Netanya will with pride tell you that he was a pupil at Rabbi Avraham Lipshitz Cheder in Cannon Street Road. In the 30s, Perkins the cleaners and Stebbings the shoe people were on the corner of Hessel Street and Commercial Road. But if there was one public house in the East End known as the Yiddish pub, then it was here, at 158 Commercial Road, that Benjamin Dubosky held court. By name, it was Mackworth Arms, but its fame was the Hamish of food, especially Dubosky's latkes. In Umberston Street, just a few yards from Hessel Street, there was the pub Captain Cook. In 1919, the publican was Solomon Hamburger. In 1923, it was Max Lederman's pub. 1930, the public house Captain Cook closed down. It became a synagogue, Kehilas Yisrael. New management soon took over. In 1938, it was known as the Kol Yaakov Shul. But by the end of the war in 1945, little remained in Umberston Street. No pub, no shul, and very few houses. What's so special about cleaning the fascia of Flick Fashions at 133 Commercial Road? It certainly is not because it is directly across the road from Hessel Street and Umberston Street. Now you can appreciate the significance. This was the Grand Palais. From 1926 until 1970, much of the repertoire of Yiddish theatre was performed here. But for my money, the King of Lampedusa will go down in history. For it was not only at the Grand Palais that in 1944 it was the record-running show. Its 8-month continuous showing made it the longest Yiddish production at any time, anywhere in the world. The national dailies and magazines, even with wartime rationing of newsprint, gave it exceptional coverage. It was a true story of Sergeant Cohen, single-handed, capturing the Italian island of Lampedusa. From all over London they came, Jew and non-Jew alike. In the play, Sergeant Cohen's family in Whitechapel are ecstatic with the news. It then moves into a dream sequence where Sergeant Cohen, now the King of Lampedusa, is discussing naval tactics with his admiral. Every audience gave thundering applause to Sergeant Cohen's proclamation in the last act. We will be victorious. All nations will be free but a hard-pressed Jewish nation. Long live Britain and her allies, the Jewish nation in Palestine. Until August 1944, nearly every performance ended with the audience, including the non-Jews, on their feet, cheering for the State of Israel to be born. In November 1946, a year after the Nazi surrender, the play was revived. Then, concentration camp survivors were running the British blockade to get into Palestine. In Poland, in Kielce, over 60 Jews were murdered in a pogrom. and Mosley's thugs were once again on the streets in Ridley Road, Hackney. London was no longer the place to clamour so enthusiastically for a Jewish state. 2 weeks later, even with the outstanding talents of Mayer and Anna Zelniker and Clara Meisels, the play was taken off. 20 years ago, the Grand Palais closed down. The theatre that could seat 480 people is now one of the many fashion houses in the Commercial Road. This view might give you the impression that we've lost our way and we're somewhere in the country. On these lawns, some 50 years ago, were the terraced houses of Fairclough Street, no more than a few minutes' walk from where the Grand Palais used to be. These houses would have backed onto Christian Street, Berners Street, and Ellen Street. On nearly every corner there was a grocery shop, and the water sprinklers never sprayed onto grass.
I was born in Cable Street. Christian Street was one of the side turnings, and that's my school, my junior school, Christian Street. Christian Street, what a name. There were 35 of us in my class, of which only 4 were non-Jewish. And right opposite was where I got bar mitzvahed, in the Commercial Road Torah. You know what was tough about my bar mitzvah? It wasn't the pasha, that was easy. It was going into the ladies' gallery, kissing my mother, my bubba, my 2 sisters, all my aunts, and everybody else who was in the gallery at the time. My best present, well, I think that was the year I joined the Oxford and George's Club. To be able to go away to camp. There's BLQ Henriques, the gaffer, in the doorway. Boy, was that excitement. Out of the streets and up and to camp. Yes, Chaim Lipshitz was right. The gaffer didn't have any time for Zionism, but he did bring a whole new dimension into our lives. It was tough to find work in the 30s, and the gaffer got many club boys their first job, including myself. The club gave us a marvellous sense of belonging. You really felt you belonged to something special. Going down Berners Street today, I don't find it easy to call it Henriques Street. You'll see the name fading away, just like the Jewish community there. But believe me, what doesn't fade away is a fantastic club spirit of the old boys and old girls of the Oxfords and Georges. That row, that's the famous club cry. It was in existence when I joined the club more than 50 years ago, and I understand it comes from a Maori war dance. But I tell you, that life we led in the East End, we didn't have a lot, but what we had we shared. We did things for our families, our friends. We had loyalty to each other. Wednesday night we meet in North London in Whetstone. Personally, I never miss it if I can help it. You know what my son said to me the other day? Dad, he said, the difference between my generation and yours from the East End is that if you've got troubles, you've got friends, real friends, who'll be only too pleased to help. With me, I have acquaintances. Those were the very words he used.
The only OSNG activity today in the East End is the Club Synagogue in Beaumont Grove settlement opposite Stepney Green Station. Here is loyalty in action. From all over London, club members and their children come to maintain the traditions of Basil Henriques. Back to the Commercial Road, the Aldgate end, with the city skyscrapers. The pale green building on the corner of Adler Street is Morrison Buildings, the last old tenement block in the Commercial Road. Only now, through wartime bombing, can we see the prison-like exterior of homes in a street which for nearly 100 years has been at the heart of London Jewry. Here was the Hambro, one of the founding synagogues of the United Synagogue. Unique was the ark at the top of a steep flight of steps. By 1936, when the Hambro rejoined the Great Synagogue, Duke's Place, parts of the Hambro in Mulberry Street became the Jewish Institute and Free Reading Room. It was the prestigious center for prize distributions, cultural events, and above all, the offices of the London Beth Din. On an autumn day in 1940, whilst the court of the chief rabbi was in session, the building was destroyed in an air raid. There were fatal casualties. But in spite of the blitz on the East End, the new Yiddish theatre, led by Nathan Beatler, opened its doors in Adler Street in 1943. The theatre was leased from the Grand Order of Israel. In 1925, when the Jewish Friendly Society movement was at the height of its activities, the Grand Order of Israel built the Adler Assembly Hall. But it was some 20 years later, in 1946, that Adler House made its own special contribution to the Yiddish theatre in London. Its artistic standards had been recognized and was awarded a grant from the Arts Council, an unprecedented honor for a Yiddish theatre company in England. Robert Atkins, the famous Shakespearean director, was invited to produce The Merchant of Venice in Yiddish. Mayor Zelniker was his Shylock, with Anna as Portia.
Playing Portia to my father's Shylock was quite unique in my whole theatrical history. There's no question that The King of Lampedusa was very special too. It was a fantastic success financially and otherwise. It was even put out by the BBC, both in Yiddish and in English. But The Merchant, it ran for 5 weeks, quite exceptional for the Yiddish theatre in those days. But to have a top West End producer directing us in Shakespeare, to be able to play, to live that quality of mercy scene with my own father, that was an experience I can never forget.
Die Qualität der Rachmunis weiß nicht von Zwingen. Sie fällt wie ein milder Regen vom Himmel herauf zu der Erde. Zweimal gebencht. Es bencht den, was gibt, in dem, was nimmt. Zum Starksten in Starken. Sie ziert den gekrönten Monarch besser wie sein Kron, in welchen sitzt Meure in Schreck von den Könige. Doch Rachmunis ist über der Zeptermacht. Sie thront in die Herzen von den Monarchen. In dus ist der Ehrenzeichen von Gott allein. In irdische Macht kann Gott zum Nunsten, denn Rachmunis steht bei Recht.
May I tell you what Beverly Baxter said about my father's Shylock? By the way, he was the Evening Standard's theatre critic, and this is what he wrote. We must acclaim Mr. Zelniker. While speaking Shakespeare's actual lines, he dominated the court scene and walked off with his beard pointing proudly upwards to the ecstatic applause of the East End audience. By the way, in the top box you can see my very good dear friend Abby Speisel, Sullivan Shulam. He did the translation. You know, all the national papers said the same thing. They knew no Yiddish, yet they said Meisel's translation was so close to the original, no wonder Robert Atkins, who also knew no Yiddish, could so successfully direct the play.
The new Yiddish theatre in Adler Street, like Feynman's theatre with its King Ahaz production, set high standards. But drama of another kind was played out when the new Yiddish theatre lost its lease to the United Synagogue in 1948. It then became the court of the Beth Din and the meeting place for the cultural activities of the Jewish Institute. For Sir Robert Whaley Cohen, then president of the United Synagogue, there was a special connection. Sir Robert was a competent cellist and regularly gave recitals in the Institute. 10 years later, the Great Synagogue, which was totally demolished in a 1941 air raid, gave up its temporary hut on its bomb site in Duke's Place to hold its services in Adler House. Today, there is no plaque or memorial stone on any building in or around Mulberry Street or Adler Street to record that here were so many major institutions of London Jewry. Only the street's name, so called after Chief Rabbi Adler in 1914, remains. Victor Lucas, in the center, is a past president of the United Synagogue and a leading communal personality in Anglo Jewry. I asked him what Adler Street and Mulberry Street mean to him.
These new buildings have no meaning whatsoever for me. My first communal appointment in 1932 was in the East End, and my real training for communal involvement was in the Whitechapel Road office of the Order Achemeth Friendly Society, where the General Secretary was Michael Waldman, later to be my father-in-law. But let's go back into Commercial Road. There's an important point I would like to make. The building on the corner of Ailey Street, opposite the Castle Pub, is today the Bank of Credit and Commerce. Many years ago, this same building was Absa House, which housed the offices of one of the largest friendly societies, the Order Achabrith and Shield of Abraham, which was founded in 1888. In the 20s and 30s, for a few pennies a week, the Friendly Society movement provided that crucial support when death, sickness or unemployment menaced the family. When one set shiver, for many East Enders, it was the few pounds from the Friendly Society to which they belonged that really mattered. No synagogue did that. Who knows? Perhaps in St. John's Wood or Hampstead, there might one day be a Waldman Terrace or Fisher Avenue, for it was giants like them, dedicated, caring communal workers, who paved the way for so many of us today.
Absa House was indeed a haven for those in need, but in a more literal sense, the massive British rail goods depot just behind Absa House sheltered some 10,000 people night after night from German air raids in 2 world wars. Today, on the site of that old massive air raid shelter, the NatWest Bank have built their computer centre, spilling over into Goodman's Fields, the Commercial Road end of Ailey Street. Computer centres were, of course, unheard of in the 1920s when the 67 tram from Barking headed for the junction where the 5 main roads of Whitechapel and Aldgate converged at Gardiner's, the gents' military and industrial outfitter. You could say nearly everybody in the East End knew Gardiner's Corner, and for one very good reason in particular. For whilst in the late 1960s, you may have seen this unusual clear view of this famous spot, for most East Enders in the 1930s, Gardiner's was the front line against Mosley and his fascists, rallying to the battle cry, "They shall not pass." On Sunday, 4th of October 1936, Mosley inspected his black shirts near the Tower of London before their attempted march up Lemon Street to pass Gardiner's Corner and then to enter Commercial Road. This was the year Hitler had marched into the Rhineland. Mussolini had conquered Ethiopia, and Franco had launched the Spanish Civil War. In Palestine, the Mufti, the pro-Nazi leader, was carrying out terrorist raids on Jewish settlements, whilst in the Polish Parliament, new anti-Jewish laws were passed. The Jews in the East End had much to worry about. Fascist propaganda and bully boy tactics were being generated from new black shirt branches in Stepney and Bethnal Green. Yet the Rabbinate and the Board of Deputies urged restraint. Toynbee Hall's Council of Citizens, only a few yards away from Gardiner's Corner, counselled the East Enders to boycott provocative demonstrations and to maintain good temper. Jack Miller today lives in Duckett Street, Stepney, close by to where the Black Shirts had their local HQ. He was at Gardiner's on that day known as the Battle of Cable Street.
When this photo of my parents, brother and sister, was taken, we were living in Princelet Street, off Brick Lane. I'm the sailor boy. When this fatal confrontation took place, we were then living near the People's Palace of the Mile End Road. I was 24. From my earliest days, I had flirted with membership of the Communist Party. I think many of us in the East End naturally saw our affinity with the CP, not because we were intellectually committed to communism, but because against the European growth of fascism, Hitler, Mussolini, Mosley in England, we saw the CP as the main body doing something actively against these demagogues. You know, inevitably, volumes of mythology surround what happened on that day. Firstly, there was no significant face-to-face fighting between the black shirts and us. It was simply an onslaught by the police on the anti-fascist demonstrators. They had orders from Mr. John Simon, their Home Secretary, to disperse us so that Mosley could march down the Commercial Road. But they did not pass. Some reports say there were 50,000 people on the streets. I can assure you they were not all members of the Communist Party, but a large number were sort of sucked into the vortex of the struggle. The strategy to block Cable Street so that the black shirts could not go through after their fight at Gardner's, well, yes, that was carefully planned by the communists, but I have no hesitation in saying, without the support of the non-Jewish residents, the dockers and other workers, I doubt very much whether we alone could have been able to stop Mosley.
The black shirts lost the Battle of Cable Street, but in the weeks that followed, Jews, children as well as grown-ups, were terrorized. Jewish shops in the East End bore the brunt of the English Nazis. But in spite of the vicious hooliganism, few questioned the decision to stand and stop Mosley at Cable Street. Cable Street runs parallel to the Commercial Road, close to the River Thames. Today it bears no resemblance to the narrow street which, after the Second World War, its Jewish residents gave way to the new immigrants. But how many of us realize that where Cable Street meets Prescott Street and Lemon Street, here was the ghetto of 18th century London Jewry? Israel Zangwill's novel, The King of Schnorrers, presents the scene so vividly for us. There was no middle class to speak of in the 18th century Jewry, wrote Zangwill. The world was divided into rich and poor, and the rich were very, very rich, and the poor very, very poor, so that everyone knew his station. And well into the 19th century, the very, very rich, they certainly knew their station. To the Hanukkah ball they would go at Bonn's Jewish Hotel in Great Prescott Street. Bonn's advertisement in the Jewish Chronicle in 1893 under the headline Joy in Jewry would quote the society columnist of the Pall Mall Gazette, but of all the dances, that at Bonn's was the gayest and the bravest. And it would seem that the Bonn's Hotel dance was such a success. It harbored oriental grace, so much music, so much light and gaiety, that the following week's Jewish Chronicle displayed this advertisement under the mistletoe. It offered from the Christmas tree, the ladies would receive their free gifts of scent, gloves and fans, and urged J.C. readers to apply at once for tickets from Mr. Simon Bonn of Bonn's Jewish Hotel. And possibly, whilst that Christmas ball was taking place at Bonn's, refugees from pogroms in Tsarist Russia were disembarking at nearby Iron Gate steps beneath Tower Bridge. A representative from the Poor Jews Temporary Shelter in Lemon Street would welcome them. Poor Jews Temporary Shelter was the official name when the shelter opened in 1885. Some 10 years later, describing the arrival of Jewish refugees at the London docks, an immigration official stated, "Strange though it seems, these immigrants bring little sickness. The immunity due to elimination during centuries of ghetto life stands them in good stead, and in the case of children, the admirable devotion and care of the parents, one of the finest traits of the Hebrew character throughout all classes, preserves their health under conditions in which the preservation of it seems impossible." This report appeared in the London Illustrated News, 30th of April, 1904. It also printed these drawings of immigrant families in the East End. In Lemon Street today, the red brick building covers where at number 82 the shelter used to be. Next door is the police station, so well known to the many immigrants reporting there. Inevitably, a few policemen hat euch gelernt a bissel Yiddish. At number 17 was the much-needed Jewish Working Girls Club. Isabel Harris, the club superintendent, had a heavy responsibility keeping newly arrived women folk from falling into the hands of pimps and those who offered them an exciting life in the Argentine. Lemon Street would certainly be a contender to Adler Street for the number of Jewish organizations it housed. For over 50 years, the Federation of Synagogues was also a neighbor to the police station before the Federation moved to Great Street. From Lemon Street, let's enter Ailey Street and pause for a moment at Simmons' house. This building, since the beginning of the century, was the Workers' Circle Friendly Society. Like other friendly societies, it cared for its members when in need, but gave emphasis to cultural and educational programs. Primarily, it projected itself as a Jewish socialist group, particularly keen on Yiddish culture. This group of children belonged to the Circus Schule. In the early 1900s, the Jews' free school just off Petticoat Lane did its best to eliminate Yiddish. English only was strictly enforced. The Workers' Circle Schule in the 1920s went the other way. Their English-speaking youngsters used the Mameloschen. Across the road from where the Workers' Circle used to be is Half Moon Passage, which would lead you through into Whitechapel High Street. The building with the red doors, the Half Moon Theatre, moved about 10 years ago near to Queen Mary's College in the Mile Road. Prior to it being a theatre, it was a Federation synagogue. But the Half Moon Passage of today has no flaking paint peeling off from its walls and no longer leads you to Whitechapel High Street. Now, a new one-way ring road diverts you from Gardeners, passing Petticoat Lane, where the lane meets Aldgate High Street. But in days gone by, Half Moon Passage would have brought you close to Camperdown House, the national headquarters of the Jewish Lads Brigade. Founded in 1895 by Colonel Goldsmith, the JLB has become a national organization with branches for young men and women throughout the country. There is an historic story to tell how the JLB came into being in the East End. It justifies a program in its own right. For the JLB has made, and is making, a significant contribution to Anglo Jewry. Motto Robbins is now, after a lifetime dedicated to JLB, Brigade Major at the HQ in South Woodford. He grew up in Langdale Mansions. At home, only Yiddish was spoken. And when the JLB officer came to his home, Mottel had to act as an interpreter. For Mottel, JLB never conflicted with his traditional Judaism, his support for Israel, and loyalty to England. With a smile, he told me, "My father was happy. I had to polish my boots and behave like a mensch." We have traveled through some of the byways close to Gardeners, but now let's move on to Aldgate Pump, from the Gardeners' corner of yesterday to the Gardeners of today. Those of you who knew this famous landmark from days gone by may be somewhat bewildered as to where you are. Well, not all is lost. Aldgate East Underground Station is still on the same spot where it used to be, on the corner of Lemon Street. Here is Gardeners in the early 70s, before it was destroyed by fire. Now, let's look at the same corner some 50 years earlier. Where Aldgate East Station was in our previous picture, we now have the public house, the Red Lion. Facing the public house doors is a shoeblack, hopefully waiting for a customer. The traffic jam in the High Street was a daily event, certainly comparable with the best today can offer. From the carts parked in the middle of the road, cow keepers and horse owners came to buy fodder. On the right, about halfway along, is where Petticoat Lane enters the High Street. Today, between the two tall buildings, you can see the Sunday morning crowds entering the market. Petticoat Lane, or Middlesex Street to use its official name, is not just one street. It is made up of many side turnings with market traders. Tubby Isaac's Jellied Eel stall is still on the Golson Street corner of Whitechapel High Street. The boundary line between the borough of Tower Hamlets, Stepney in days gone by, and the City of London runs right down the middle of Middlesex Street. The policeman is chatting to tourists in Tower Hamlets, whilst the white building complex is in the City of London. The story of Petticoat Lane and its surrounding streets is one of Springboard's popular programmes. So let's return into Aldgate High Street with Aldgate Pump just a few hundred yards ahead of us. The pub on the left, Hoop and Grapes, is one of the few old 19th century houses in Aldgate. In the early 1920s, it was a warehouse of Christopher Hill, the wine merchants. But I wonder, was the meat merchant next door, Henry Nathan, a kosher wholesaler? Along this stretch of Aldgate High Street, there were a number of meat dealers with Samuel Abrams, Horvitz and Lewison, and Emmanuel Nathan among them. Nice to note that the milk was kept some way from the meat. Aldgate Pump to us East End kids was a lifesaver. On Shabbos afternoons, we'd walk miles from Bow to see the model ships in the city shipping office windows. Here we were refreshed at the city's expense before our long walk home. Some 200 years earlier, the Pump was a famous landmark where Leadenhall Street and Fenchurch Street met in Aldgate. This was the period where, only a few yards away in Duke's Place, the great synagogue was built. But today, the sun has truly set on what was for hundreds of years the glory of Anglo Jewry. The red car in Duke's Place is passing where the great synagogue stood. There is a plaque on this wall commemorating the grate from 1690 until it was destroyed by German air raids in 1941. Much has been written about the history of the great synagogue, the influence it has had on synagogue tradition and decorum throughout the world. For us, those who claim to be East Enders, there was the reverence, one could say the awe most of us had for Duke's Place. In the alphabetical sequence of the synagogue's membership, the squalid streets of Brick Lane and Hanbury Street were on a par with Tring Park and with St. Swithin's Lane. Police in the 30s would pacify queues of worshippers unable to get into the Friday night choral service. Decorum and traditions were sacred. On one occasion, the chazan turned his head to look behind him at the choir located in the clock gallery. There was an unprecedented discord. The choirmaster was relieved of his post. Nobody chatted in Duke's Place. One look from the beadle was enough. There was a religious drama which gave dignity and inspiration to generations of East Enders. Today, high above the Congregation of Jacob Shul, the Magen David breaks the heaven like a lone star, recalling the bright, warm Jewish light that in days gone by brightened the streets around Commercial Road.